Yeah.
Right. I'll do a quick introduction as well. So we're very happy to have Camilla with us today. Camilla, thank you so much for agreeing to speak to us. And I know that it's really early morning for you, and I apologize for that. But we're very, very happy that you're joining in. She's joining in from London today. And Camilla Ween is an architect, urbanist, and Harvard Loeb Fellow. She works at the intersection of transport infrastructure and the urban realm, focusing on sustainable cities and sustainable communities. She's worked for Transport for London for 11 years, where she was responsible for advising the Mayor of London on the implications for transport and land use policy and development, and developing planning policy for many of London's key growth areas. She is a committee member of the United Nations Urban Economy Forum, which seeks to promote cities that will deliver the UN Sustainability Development Goals. She's also the author of several books and lectures at universities, and gives lectures at universities in the UK and the USA, and also at international conferences. Her book Future Cities talks, amongst other things, about how design and policy innovation is helping some cities tackle issues of population growth, of climate change, and other relevant topics. And with that, Camilla, I would like for you to take over, and I'll quickly share the screen again. Yep, all yours, Camilla.
Great. Okay, well, thank you so much and welcome everybody to the session. I can't see you, but I actually got a long list of initials, so I gather you're all there. Unfortunately, you can't see me. I don't know why my video is not working. Anyway, so I just want to go through today, and what I want to stress in this lecture is how society really needs a paradigm shift because of the crises that we're in at the moment. It's very much time to change. So I think what we have been doing in the last 200 years has resulted in a situation that is untenable now. So we need to say, so if you go to the next slide, I think that will show what I'm going to cover. Yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the urgency, why there is such an urgent situation, and what the challenges are, and then a few sort of ideas about solutions and reflections really on how we're going to actually change. So next, please. So the basic thing is that we're in a situation at the moment. We have two crises that are sort of happening simultaneously, and I think they're mistakenly often separated. One is the sort of climate change crisis, and the other one is the environmental crisis. But they are completely linked, and they shouldn't really be separated, I don't believe. We need to think of them together. But the reality is that we have missed so many targets that have been set over the last few decades. So the question now really is how much longer do we have before we are in an irreversible situation? Next. So I think one of the very worrying things is that 2 years ago, less than 2 years ago, the UN came out with its report on species extinction. And what was very clear is that what we're doing, the damage that we're creating to the environment is likely to continue until 2050, and that they describe it as a sort of casino of death. But it basically means that even though we've been aware of many of these situations that are damaging the climate and the planet, we seem to be unable to actually change our way of doing things to change and to halt this sort of perpetual degradation. Next. So I think one of the key questions is, how much do we want? How much is enough, or what does equality look like? We tend to sort of think that we've got to have more and more, and we seem to be unable to really think, to sort of pull back and to combine. What we need to do is combine economic process with social justice and environmental safety. So that's the key thing that we have to do. And economic progress in the past has been sort of seen about just taking more and more, being better and better, bigger and bigger. outdoing our competitors, which has meant that it has impacted very negatively on other communities where we are helping ourselves to their raw materials. Next, please. So I think the things that we can do, what we need to think about seriously and change, is the previous slide about, you know, what we actually want, but also I think in terms of transport, we've got to think about, so you can go to the next slide, I think. Yeah, no, this is the right side. So the first thing that we need to do is to think about city design. Cities shape the way we do things. So if we build cities that are purely for cars, that's what we're going to be doing. We've got to be thinking about building cities that have a more benign lifestyle, where we can walk and where we can cycle, where we aren't so heavily reliant on transport and traffic, but that we can actually walk and cycle to places that we need to be at. We need to think about the building materials so that when we build our houses, we're not actually contributing to the carbon emissions. Our construction systems are very energy intensive, so concrete is a disastrous material. It uses massive amount of energy. So we need to think about different ways to actually build our cities. Next. And we also need to think about transport and building and thinking about our economy so that it's not reliant on long distance haulage of stuff we need within the cities and where we're living, so that we think much more local, so that, you know, the transport miles for every product that we use or every piece of food that we eat comes with very low transport miles, not thousands of miles or halfway across the globe. So we've got to get out of this cycle of car dependency, but also long haul freight, be it trucks or be it aeroplanes. Next, please. We've also got to think about how we actually grow. So we know the population is growing. We know that the cities are growing, i.e. more people are migrating from the countryside into urban areas. But we cannot just be sort of rolling out wallpaper cities across the land until we kind of come to a barrier, until we reach the sea or the mountains. We've got to be thinking about cities that work in their entirety, not these kind of places that really have no sense of community. And really, this kind of development that's on the slide forces people to travel very long distances to a city centre for work or to some other centre for their shopping and so on. So we need to think totally differently about how we lay out and that growth and how we plan for the growth. And what we really got to stop producing is these sort of nowhereville places, dead-end places that have no sense of community and where people don't want to stay. They want to leave to go to get the sort of sustenance for their pockets, for their work, or for their soul, to meet other people. These places are empty and soulless, and they cannot support human life in a sustainable way. Next, please. The big problem is that we are exploiting our biocapacity. So that's the biocapacity of the globe. And we're exceeding that biocapacity every year. And I don't know if you've come across the term overshoot, but that overshoot day, which we used to perhaps in the 1960s and 70s, we were working within the boundaries of the capacity of the globe. But more recently, we are sort of reaching that overshoot point almost halfway through the year. So it means that anything beyond that overshoot point means that we are extracting resources that cannot be replaced. And I think this is the absolute problem, is that, you know, we are degrading the planet more and more. We need to be able to live in harmony with the planet. And the way we're working is that it's increasing inequality and poverty, which is particularly local people and indigenous people are being either displaced or their livelihoods are being extremely damaged. the planet is being damaged, and we're seeing loss of biodiversity and floods, etc. So next, please. And we've got to tackle waste. Currently, we are just discarding everything that once we've finished with it, and we are not thinking about the embodied carbon and the embodied resources that are within those materials. We just send them to landfill. And there is another issue as well, that we are literally polluting our source, the very sources that we rely on, our oceans and our rivers and so on. Next, please. Intensive farming is one of the major problems of our current practices that are damaging the environment totally. We are literally taking land, we're cutting down forests that we rely on to monitor our air quality and our environment, to produce food that is incredibly intensive. So you know, it's intensive agriculture is taking up, well, something like 30% of land, 75% of freshwater resources, and it's probably responsible for something like maybe 50% of total emissions. So Robert Goodland, back in the 1990s, I think it was, the UN came out with a report saying that intensive farming was responsible for 18% of carbon emissions. Where this chap, Robert Goodland, he left the UN and he spent 5 years, I think, recalculating it. And when you think about food, that goes into producing of the food, but there are also associated things like the loss of carbon sequestration that you have when you cut down forests, but there's also the transportation and the refrigeration of food. So altogether, he reckons that it's something like up to 50%. So we need to completely revise how we produce our food. And apart from the energy side of things, we're also destroying the soil. So that sort of intensive farming relies on basically taking the soil, pumping in fertilizer, taking crops, and what you leave behind is virtually completely sterile land, whereas sort of more traditional forms of farming allow for soil health, allow for the bacteria and for the organisms to build up in the soil. We won't need fertilizers if we go back to more traditional farming. Next, please. I think we've got to recognize that our use of basically everything on the planet and carbon dioxide buildup in the planet is related to our human activity. And the slide shows very clearly that the rise in human activity and the rise in global population and the rise in carbon dioxide almost exactly parallel each other. So it's very clear that we are actually responsible for that impact. So we need to think about how we're going to live if we're going to survive the planet. Next, please. And also almost all our industries. I mean, this shows very clearly how our industries are very energy intensive and very water intensive. So major industries that we are relying on. So we need to actually change those industries. Next, please. And I think we need to think about how we take care of the planet. So at the moment, we are kind of just destroying the planet for our own purposes. And it's our sort of desire for progress, but we need to actually get to a situation where we are operating in harmony. Bank account. I mean, you can keep plundering it, but at a certain point, there's nothing more to plunder, and will be probably our own extinction if we don't sort this out very soon. Next. I think another thing that we really have to think about is our banking systems and our financial institutions. I mean, the concept of money was originally created for us to to be able to transact with each other in a convenient way. But banking has sort of become an industry in itself, and it's not serving us anymore. It's serving a few to make money. So we need to get back to a system where we respect that banks are sort of protected by governments, and they're simply there to assist with that transaction of wealth for us to buy and sell our goods. Next, please. And we need to think about a new kind of economy, because at the moment, the globe seems to be absolutely fixated on this idea of GDP, which only measures a few things, but doesn't measure everything. And the problem is it doesn't measure life expectancy. It doesn't measure well-being. It's simply about growth, growth, growth. And this growth has been sort of going on for, well, certainly the last half century. And it's leading to inequality. So it's leading to very high wealth in certain places and amongst certain companies or people, and it's leaving the rest of the planet behind. So we need to rethink our economic models. I think we need to go, and I'll talk a bit about that later, but there are alternative economic models that don't just rely on grow, grow, grow. And the grow, grow, grow thing, the problem with it is that companies in this current model succeed if they're cheaper than their competitors. That's how they outdo their competitors. Well, how do you get cheaper is by plundering the resources from people who are poor already and desperately want anything. So you undercut, so you're not really paying the real value of what you're taking, but you're actually undercutting all the time, which means more and more inequality and more poverty. Next, please. I think also our sort of government systems are not really supporting an inclusive society. They're basically perpetuating it very often inequalities and separation. The bottom slide shows the kind of juxtaposition of kind of shantytown development on one side and, you know, what you would call a decent life on the other side of a wall. I think that's from South Africa, that image. The really problematic thing, I think, that is not talked about sufficiently is the fact that there are so many people trapped in modern slavery, and it's often invisible. Even in great cities like London, there are people who are trafficked into London who work as slaves for their masters, or they're trapped sort of semi-legally by having to produce food at a very low, or goods, whatever it is, at a very low return. So they can't really live a decent life. They are completely trapped and ruled by their masters. Next, please. So I include this, and I'm going to read it because I think it's a very powerful message from Professor Speth. And he said, I used to think that the top global environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. And I thought that with 30 years of good science, we could address these problems, but I was wrong. And he says now the top environmental problems are in fact selfishness, greed, and apathy. And the fundamental problem is overconsumption, poor governance, and accountability. So the way we are living is actually not in tune with the planet. We are taking too much, and we are governing ourselves very poorly, and we don't really care what people do. We don't expose wrongdoing. We allow it to go because it's in the sort of name of progress. Next. So next again. So thinking about what we can do, I think we can design cities completely differently so that they are nice places to be. There's room for people to meet, to talk, to enjoy each other's company. There's room for children to play, and there's room for people just to walk to what they need to get to rather than having to drive their car. So by creating nice walking environments, people and placing, having the sort of going away from traditional zoning where one thing happens on one side of the city and miles away something else happens, but by having mixed use, so that you have in your local neighborhood, you have the ability to buy your food, you have the ability to go to work, you have the ability to get all the things that you might need, your pharmacies and so on, and medical services, everything being local and easily accessed by foot or on cycle. Next. I mean, it's very much also about creating good public transport. So having sort of low emission transport. So, I mean, walking and cycling is obviously part of that. Having, using cycles, cargo bikes for deliveries for the sort of last mile or so. There's no reason why vans have to be going through our very densely populated areas, emitting emissions, you know, polluting the air, when a cargo bike with virtually zero emissions, apart from the tiny little bit to produce that bicycle, it's a zero emission situation. And then attractive buses and trams when you need to get a little bit further away, which does, of course, sometimes happen. You can't have everything on your doorstep, things that you only access occasionally, and it might be sort of universities, hospitals, things like that might be a little bit further away from where you live, and they're going to be collected in places. So you do need good connections that connect all those other functions of the city. Next, please. So we need to think about how we actually lay out the cities, and there are various models that work well. I mean, one thing is the transport oriented design, which was sort of has been around for a long time, and the idea was that, you know, that a lot of cities actually have very good transport networks already, but they've been gradually over the years, instead of moving people, are moving perhaps goods and freight and other things, but or moving straight through the city from one side to the other, so express services but not stopping. But if you actually allow to have stops on a railway system, and so the slide on the left shows Curitiba in Brazil, where actually development has happened along a corridor, a transport corridor, and all these people can then walk to a station and be able to access the center of the city or wherever they were. I don't particularly like that model because I think it's not sufficiently mixed use. I think a much better model is perhaps the middle one, which is the idea of a polycentric city. So it's a city that has lots of centers, but that you can move between the various centers if you want to go somewhere else to meet your friends or to go out or the theater or whatever it is, but that the distances are relatively short, and each neighborhood essentially offers most of the things that you need every day. The slide on the right is actually a British model that we've been promoting here in the UK, which is